In the spring of 1970, a music journalist named Ellen Sander sat across from Jim Morrison in a hotel room in Los Angeles and recorded something that has never been published. Not the interview itself, she had published interviews before, would publish again. What she recorded that afternoon, across nearly 3 hours on a reel-to-reel machine she had carried up in a canvas bag, was the only conversation she ever had with a subject that she made the deliberate decision, immediately afterward, never to print, not to excerpt, not to summarize, not to reference in the profiles and retrospectives she would write across the following decades. She placed the transcript in a drawer in her apartment and did not open the drawer again for 17 years. When she finally opened it in 1987, she read through what she had transcribed and then put it back in the drawer. And closed it again. She did not publish it. She did not mention it to anyone who might publish it. She kept it with a care that she later described, in the only oblique reference she ever made to the interview's existence, as the most ethically serious thing she had ever done in her professional life. This is the story of that interview, of what Ellen Sander heard, of why she made the choice she made, and of what her choice reveals about Jim Morrison, the person behind the cultural mythology that no released recording, no official biography, no collection of concert footage has ever fully captured. The story is also necessarily incomplete in its center. The content of what Jim Morrison said in those 90 unguarded minutes is not available, protected by the decision of the person who received it. But incomplete stories are sometimes the most honest ones. The shape of a thing, preserved accurately, can carry more truth than a full account assembled from fragments and inference. This shape is preserved, and it is enough. Ellen Sander was 30 years old in 1970 and had been covering rock music for 5 years, at a moment when rock criticism was still inventing its own standards and deciding what it owed to its subjects and its readers simultaneously. She had written for Saturday Review, for Jazz and Pop, for other publications that were trying to find a language adequate to what was happening in popular music. She had interviewed most of the major figures of the era, had sat with Jimi Hendrix, with Janis Joplin, with the Beatles collectively and individually. She was not easily surprised by famous people. She had developed, through 5 years of proximity to fame at close range, a fairly stable sense of the difference between the person and the persona, between what a public figure projected and what they actually contained. She was also deeply serious about her work in a way that distinguished her from the majority of the entertainment press. She brought genuine critical intelligence to her subjects and expected in return that her subjects would give her something real. She had also developed through that experience a finely calibrated sense of the difference between the interviews that produced useful journalism and the interviews that produced something else, something that the language of journalism was not well designed to handle, something that arrived in the space between the professional interaction and the human one. She had encountered this before, twice in 5 years. By 1970, she had a better understanding of the distinction than she had had at the beginning, and the understanding would be tested by what happened in the hotel room on Sunset Boulevard. She had requested the interview with Jim Morrison 3 times before it was granted, each time being told that Jim was unavailable. When it was finally arranged in March 1970, the circumstances were informal enough to suggest that the arrangement had been Jim's rather than his management's, that he had decided, for reasons she did not know and did not ask about, to grant the interview himself without the usual infrastructure of publicists and handlers. They met at a hotel on Sunset Boulevard, in a room that had the quality of a room Jim had been in for a while, books open on the bed, notebooks on the desk, the particular disorder of a person who lives inside their own thinking. He offered her coffee. He asked about her work before she asked about his. Jim Morrison in a room without handlers was a different proposition from Jim Morrison in a room with them. The infrastructure of management existed precisely to prevent the kind of exchange that an intelligent journalist sought. In its absence, something different was possible. Ellen Sander had been in enough of these rooms to know the difference between the managed version and the real one. She set up her recorder and waited. The first hour was what she had expected, expansive and intelligent and carefully managed. The interview Jim Morrison had given in various versions across 3 years of press coverage, the discussion of Nietzsche and Rimbaud and Blake, the thoughts on performance and the nature of the rock concert as ritual space. She had read everything he had said before. She had prepared questions designed to get past it. What she had not prepared for was the moment, somewhere in the second hour, when he stopped performing the interview entirely. She described this moment in the only account she ever gave of it. She described it as a shift visible in his body before it was visible in his words. A kind of settling, a release of some maintained tension, the physical signal of a person who has decided to stop managing how they are being perceived and simply say what is true. She said it happened without warning and without apparent cause. One moment he was answering a question about the relationship between the Doors' music and his published poetry, and the next moment he was saying something entirely different, something that had not been prompted by the question, and that the question had, in some sense, merely cleared the way for. What he said in that shift was that he was frightened, not a general or abstract fear, not the existential dread that his public persona had made into a kind of trademark. A specific, named personal fear, the fear that he had become, over 3 years of fame and performance and the massive public investment in his image, someone he did not recognize as himself. He said that the Jim Morrison who walked onto concert stages and performed The Lizard King was real in the sense that he was genuinely present in those performances, genuinely inhabited them. But that person was not the whole of him. And the part of him that was not that person, the part that sat alone with notebooks, that had been writing since adolescence in the private language of someone who had never expected anyone to read it, that loved specific books and specific places and specific conversations, that part was becoming harder to locate. He said that fame did something to the interior life that was difficult to articulate and easy to underestimate from the outside. It reorganized the hierarchy of the self, promoted the public version to a position of dominance over the private one, until the private one began to feel like a memory of something rather than an ongoing reality. He said he was afraid that the process was further along than he had acknowledged, and that he was not certain Paris, which he was already planning, would be sufficient to reverse it. Ellen Sander listened to all of this and continued to record it. She asked him questions, not the questions on her prepared list, but the questions that the conversation itself generated, the questions of someone who is genuinely trying to understand rather than to collect quotable material. She asked what the private part felt like. In the moments when he could still access it, he said it felt like the writing, the private writing, not the published poetry, not the lyrics, but the notebooks, the daily practice of putting words on pages that no one would see. He said it felt like the early morning before anyone else was awake, when the day was still unmade and the self had not yet been required to perform its social function. She asked what it felt like when the private part was not accessible. He said it felt like trying to remember something you know you knew but cannot retrieve, the frustrating partial presence of something that exists but won't come when called. He said the performances sometimes helped, that the stage, paradoxically, occasionally gave him access to the private self, because it required a kind of total presence that bypassed the managed surface and went directly to what was underneath, but that this was becoming less reliable, and that the gap between what he felt on stage and what he could access off it was widening in ways that frightened him when he thought about them directly. She asked him whether he believed the private part could be recovered. He was quiet for a long time, then he said he didn't know. He said he hoped Paris would provide an answer. He said that the answer he was most afraid of receiving was not the negative one, not the discovery that the private self was genuinely gone, but the intermediate one. The discovery that it was still there but smaller, diminished by the years of subordination to the public self, no longer capable of the kind of sustained creative work that had mattered most. A diminished private self was harder to grieve than an absent one, because it was still present enough to measure its own diminishment. Ellen Sander sat with this. She was a journalist. She had a recorder running. She had an editor expecting a profile. What she had been given was the most significant conversation she had ever had with a public figure in 5 years of journalism, material that would have constituted the most revealing interview Jim Morrison had ever given. She understood its value. She was also in that hotel room understanding something else, that it had been given to her in a specific register of trust, in the voice of someone who had stopped performing and was speaking as a person, and that publishing it would be a violation of the terms under which it had been offered. The ethical framework she was working within was not the framework that most journalism used, the framework of information, the public interest in knowing, the subject's implicit acceptance of scrutiny. She was working within a different framework, one that had to do with the nature of trust and what trust required of the person to whom it was extended. Jim Morrison had not explicitly asked for confidentiality. She also understood that the absence of an explicit request did not mean the absence of an implicit one. The register in which the conversation had been conducted was its own form of communication. The level of honesty it had reached was a statement about the terms under which the honesty was being offered. Publishing it would be ignoring that statement. The decision carried a professional cost she acknowledged and paid without complaint. She had spent 3 months securing the interview. She had an editor waiting for a significant profile. She had the best material she had ever gathered in 5 years of work, choosing not to use it was not a small thing. The thing that was most significant about what Jim had said was precisely the thing that made publishing it wrong. It had been said as a person, not as a public figure, and the distinction was real and mattered. She made the decision in the hotel room before she left. The knowing arrived before the reasoning. The reasoning came later, that publishing it would reduce Jim Morrison to the content of his fear, would take the most honest thing he had said in 3 years of press coverage, and turn it into a story about a rock star's vulnerability, which was not what it was. What it was a person speaking honestly about a genuine crisis of identity to a journalist he had apparently decided to trust, and the trust deserved a response commensurate with its realness. Jim Morrison died 14 months after the interview. He had gone to Paris in March 1971, 1 year to the month after the conversation. He died in July 1971 without knowing whether Ellen Sander had published the interview. He had never asked. She had never told him she wouldn't. The arrangement between them was one of those understandings that exist in the unspoken territory between two people who have had a real conversation and have both understood its terms without needing to make them explicit. Ellen Sander continued working as a music journalist for many years after Jim's death. She never referenced the 1970 interview publicly. She mentioned it once in passing in a 1994 letter to a colleague, saying only that she had conducted it, that it had been significant, and that she had chosen not to publish it on ethical grounds she continued to regard as correct. She did not summarize its contents. She did not quote from it. She mentioned it as the background to a point she was making about the ethics of journalism, and then moved on. The transcript exists. It is in the possession of Ellen Sander's estate, held by her daughter, who has maintained her mother's decision with the same care that her mother maintained it. What the interview's existence tells us about Jim Morrison is not the content of what he said, which remains protected. What it tells us is the shape of the thing, that in March 1970, 1 year before his death, Jim Morrison sat in a hotel room and spoke honestly about the most significant fear of his interior life to a person he had decided to trust. That the honesty was complete, that the version of Jim Morrison who spoke that afternoon was the version that his music had been trying to approximate for 3 years but had never quite reached. That he trusted Ellen Sander with this, not because he knew she would protect it, but because the conversation had arrived at the place where trust was the only available response to the quality of attention she was bringing, and that she protected it not because he asked her to, but because the protection was what the trust deserved. That is the Jim Morrison who existed beneath the mythology, not the lizard king, not the beautiful self-destructive poet. The person in a hotel room in Los Angeles who stopped performing an interview and started talking for 90 minutes about what it actually felt like to be him, who was heard, whose honesty was honored by the person who received it, even at the cost of the story that the honesty would have made. That cost is the measure of what the trust was worth, and the fact that both parties paid it, each in their own way, is perhaps the truest thing available about what Jim Morrison was looking for in the years when the looking was most urgent. He was looking for someone who would hear him as a person and not as a story. For 90 minutes in a Los Angeles hotel room in March 1970, he found exactly that, and Ellen Sander heard him in the way that he had been trying to be heard, not for what he represented, not for what he performed, for what he actually was.